Welcome to the MacArthur Memorial Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Williams. Join me as we explore the life and legacy of General of the Army Douglas MacArthur and discuss a wide range of military history topics, from the American Civil War to the Korean War. In December 1944, as General Douglas MacArthur continued the invasion of the Philippines, Admiral William Halsey's Third Fleet was caught in a violent typhoon that capsized ships, resulted in the loss of hundreds of sailors, and set in motion extraordinary acts of courage and survival. Halsey faced a court-martial in the aftermath, yet this remarkable and tragic episode is often overshadowed by other events of the war. Today, we are pleased to host Tom Clavin, co-author of the book Halsey's Typhoon, to discuss the storm, the decisions that shaped the disaster, and the lasting impact on the Navy and on the Admiral MacArthur called the greatest sailor of the age. Welcome, sir, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Amanda, for having me on your program.
So why don't you set the stage for us to start? What was the strategic situation in the Pacific in, say, October, November 1944?
Well, the good news was that MacArthur and the U.S. Navy were close to controlling the seas, the Western Pacific. There had been the Battle of Leyte Gulf back in June, which is pretty much after that the military officials in Tokyo decided we really can't compete with the U.S. Navy anymore. We're out of carriers. Everything we do from now on is going to be a delaying tactic. Let's see if we can delay the Allies getting near the homeland, because they knew eventually there was going to be an invasion of Japan. So MacArthur was working his way up the Philippines. Halsey's Third Fleet was, he wasn't excited about it, but basically they were somewhat guard duty in the sense that they were protecting, any attack from the sea, what was left of the Japanese Navy, and also the planes would knock Japanese planes out of the sky rather than have them thwart any invasions. So it was a good situation in that they were making progress up the Philippines. It was a bad situation that they had to slog step by step, because as Allies got closer to the Japanese homeland, the resistance got even more tough.
So why don't you introduce us to Admiral Halsey and his war to this point, and then what role was his Third Fleet expected to play in the Philippines campaign? I think you've already kind of touched a little bit on that, but just give us a better sense of him and the Third Fleet.
Well, Halsey hails from New Jersey, which is kind of a nice coincidence that his flagship in the Third Fleet was named in New Jersey, which, if people are interested, can be found in Camden, New Jersey, of all places. He was, I think we can't underestimate the esteem that the American public held Halsey in. He always seemed to be, from the very beginning, a attack dog for the U.S. Navy. He was the one that didn't, dither over decisions. He made his decision and he took action. So what he was supposed to do with MacArthur, and I should point out they had a good relationship. A lot of MacArthur's relationships with other Navy personnel were kind of filled with friction, but with Halsey, I'm not saying it was a perfect relationship, but they were pretty friendly with each other, and they understood each other as having one goal in mind, and that was to get to Tokyo. So Halsey was he was good copy. The reporters loved him because he spoke very directly. He was very salty language. Some might think that how did he get the nickname Bull Halsey? It was because of a typo. He had given an interview to a reporter who was drunk, and when he typed his copy, he typed Bull Halsey instead of Bill Halsey. And when the editor saw that back where the newspaper was writing for, he said, "I like this. We're going to go with this." So from that point on, Halsey never really cared for it, but he was Bull Halsey. But that was a good nickname for him. He would charge ahead like a bull. He was relentless, and he wanted to. He was hoping that he could be a big role in MacArthur's campaign, because he had, in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, he had been too decisive. He had actually fallen for a trap and taken his squadron out of position. They called it the Battle of Bull's Run, because he went the wrong way. So he hoped that the Philippine campaign and supporting MacArthur would it was a redemption for him.
We know from history that typhoons can have a major impact, obviously, on naval operations, again, regardless of century, or hurricanes or cyclones, etc. We talk a lot about Eisenhower and the weather forecast for D-Day. I mean, there's been tons of ink spilled over that. But what kind of information did Halsey have about the weather, and how reliable was the U.S. ability to forecast in the Pacific? What kinds of technology are they being able to bring to bear?
Not very much. The as the book Halsey's Typhoon points out, weather forecasting in the Pacific had not changed in centuries. A lot of it was based on what the captain felt and sensed and thought from looking at the conditions as they might be deteriorating. What Halsey did have was somebody called an aerologist, and that was basically the ancestor of the meteorologist, our modern day weatherman. And he had bulletins that would come to him from Pearl Harbor, which didn't do a lot of good because the conditions in Pearl Harbor, 3,000 or so miles away, is not going to be very helpful when you're near the Philippines. Other ships and it would communicate with each other saying, "Oh, I just passed through a squall at such and such coordinates." Radar which is so relied upon today, it was not very effective. It was mostly used as a military weapon, the radar. It could send confusing images. You might not know if you're picking up a severe storm on radar or a flock of attacking, Japanese planes. So a lot of it was just chatter that went with the captains of each other. So Halsey was basically relying on his experience as a captain and as an admiral, and he was relying on his aerologist who plotted out a course based on what Pearl Harbor told him that would have the Typhoon passing by his fleet by at least 200 miles, so everything would be okay. That's what Halsey had to go on. He had no other information that would say, wait a minute, I don't think that's right. Until, of course, the conditions got so bad it was too late.
Why don't you walk us through the storm and the decisions that he's making and the different factors that are shaping his judgment?
One of the first things that we did, Bob Drury and I did when we were developing the book, was we realized that Typhoon Cobra, which I believe was the first named typhoon as far as the U.S. Weather Service was concerned, Typhoon Cobra was an actual character in the book. And what we meant by that is that it seemed that the typhoon was stalking the Third Fleet. Every time it made a direction change, the typhoon would follow. It was almost like it was boxing the fleet into a corner, and then it pounced. And the conflicting information didn't help. The typhoon was almost inevitable. That's what I mean by a character. It was like a sinister character in the book, and it was an extraordinary storm. There probably have been and were greater, more powerful storms, but this is enormously powerful. The winds were sometimes 170, 180 mile gusting to 170 miles an hour. The waves that they faced were 70, sometimes 80 feet. The storm was so relentless that every time Halsey was trying to refuel his ships and when a typhoon struck, which made a lot of them very vulnerable. And the big important issue that he had that he could do nothing about really was that because so many of his ships were low on fuel, they were more vulnerable to the wind because they were riding higher. The other problem that they had, which only perceived it during a storm was a problem, is that a lot of the ships, the destroyers, destroyer escorts, even a handful of the battleships were top heavy. Since they had been built, they had been installing radar equipment, more guns, more guns you could pack onto the deck of a ship, the better. So what happened again was they would be heavier on the top than they used to be. So the waves would push them over, and eventually the storm it damaged a number of ships, but the sank three of them. And the same scenario with each one of them. They could see that when a wave would push them over, they'd go to 70 degrees, which in many cases was the top that the machine, the instrument went was 70 degrees. They'd see it trying to get past 70 degrees, which is like almost impossible to come back from. And for three ships, it proved to be true.
There's a biography of Admiral Willis Lee, who was a battleship commander during the war. And if my memory holds, I think at some point he notices that there's this storm, and you're right, it's uncanny how it seems to just follow them or be in front of them wherever they're trying to go. But Lee, I think at one point recognizes this is a much bigger storm, a much bigger problem than we think it is. And I believe at one point he tries to kind of elevate that to Halsey and say, hey, I think this is this, but he doesn't push much after that. And so could you speak perhaps to maybe the dynamics of the fleet and Halsey's command? I mean, would it be normal for someone like Admiral Lee to keep pushing and saying, hey, I think this is a problem. Hey, I think we should rethink. Or do you say something like that to Halsey and then get maybe a no, and then you leave it?
Yeah, I think the latter is true. Yeah, but Halsey was beloved by a lot of his sailors. They liked the idea of the fighting admiral. who really seemed to care about his bosun mates and his quartermasters and all down the line. But he's also a very strong authority figure to his officers and his other captains and those under his command in the Third Fleet. So I think in the case of Willis Lee, he was right to report the conditions he was sailing in. Probably could have pushed a little harder, but at the same time, when the admiral, your supreme commander of your fleet, says, I hear you, but I'm being told something else by my aerologist or some other captains elsewhere. Thanks for the information, but carry on. So I
Right.
think Halsey's intense authority may have worked against him.
So it must have been just an absolutely terrifying event. I mean, you're talking about the size of some of these, the waves and things like that. Overall, what are the casualties and how many ships are damaged or just lost?
Well, dozens of ships were damaged. The three ships were lost: the Spence, the Monaghan, and the. Let me make sure I get the other one up there. Spence, the Monaghan, and the Hull. You mentioned word terrifying. Really, there were some officers that were actually paralyzed by the sheer enormity and intensity and almost like majesty of this typhoon. When you're facing, waves that are 70 and even 80 feet, when you're facing sustained winds of 154 miles an hour, as I said before, going as high and gusting to 170, 180, from I would wager to say for 98% of the men aboard the ships in that fleet, they'd never experienced anything like that before. It might be true of every one of them. And in fact, one of the characters in the book, a captain named Marks, he literally becomes paralyzed. I mean, he's on the deck of he's on the captain's cabin, not the cabin, but the deck of the ship, and he can't move. He can't speak. He just checks out. And his chief bosun mate Archie de Riker saying, "You got to tell us what to do, what to do." He couldn't make a decision. Just as an aside, some of your listeners may be familiar with the Caine Mutiny by Herman Wouk, and he based the character of Queeg on Marks, who became paralyzed. In the case of the Caine Mutiny, some people might remember the movie version. Humphrey Bogart becomes paralyzed; he can't make a decision. So yes, it was terrifying to the point where some sailors and even officers were unable to act.
And how many casualties in terms of the sailors?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because there were about 900, give or take, about 900 sailors went into the sea, sailors and officers went into the sea. And the final estimate, I believe, was that there were 802 seamen were lost. So that discrepancy, how did, in a typhoon, how did those other guys get rescued? And that's where, if I can anticipate your next question, that's where the USS Tabor comes in.
You read my mind. So, in the introduction, we talked about extraordinary acts of courage. So, why don't you tell us about the crew of the USS Tabor?
Well, the Tabor was a destroyer escort, and they were a little more modern than destroyers. And one of the reasons why they were more modern is they were better equipped. The balance of the ship made it better equipped to deal with severe storms. Still, the Tabor had never been in something like this before. Destroyer escort. It was captained by a man named Henry Plage, who ironically was from a landlocked state of Oklahoma. And he was his crew really liked him a lot. He was very fair to them. He was strict but fair. He knew every one of his men aboard. They had approximately 120 men, I think, aboard the Tabor. And he was a kind of a charismatic kind of guy. They nicknamed him Cary Grant because of his good looks. And they would sometimes joke Cary Grant is the captain of our ship. So the Tabor was severely damaged. In fact, its mast had been torn off. And it was just waiting for the order from Halsey to be able to abandon the rest of the fleet and seek shelter somewhere or head back where it had come from and get out of the storm as soon as possible. And in fact, Halsey had given an order to rendezvous at a certain point in a few hours. But it was the night of December 18th, I believe, was when one of the sailors on the Tabor was trying to rig an emergency antenna because they had lost their radio ability, and he saw a light bobbing in the water, and he heard a couple of shouts like "Help! Help!" His assumption was that somebody on the Tabor had fallen overboard. When they made their way there and actually found the guy, and they dragged him aboard, he was all exhausted and everything, but he managed to identify himself and said, "I was from the USS Hull." And they said, "Well, if you're from the Hull, what are you doing here?" He said, "My ship sank." And that's when they first realized that there had to be other men in the water. So Plage actually more than once disobeyed a direct order from Halsey to rendezvous with the rest of the fleet because he realized that if there were other men in the water, he couldn't just sail away Otherwise, there might not be anybody else that had a chance to them. And in fact, when he did at first, the second time the order came from Halsey to make this rendezvous, and the captain started to comply with it, he looked around and his men had this real hangdog look, like don't do this, Captain. And when he countermanded himself and said, yes, okay, we're staying here, they all cheered because they wanted to get their fellow sailors out of the water. I think the final tally was out of the 80 or so sailors who were rescued, I think between 55 and 60 of them by the Tabor alone. And that the heroism of that captain and crew can't be overstated.
No, it's an incredible, incredible story. So after the disaster, Halsey faces a court-martial. And what are the main findings, and how did senior leaders like, say, Admiral Nimitz and other folks in Navy leadership, how do they respond?
Well, what Halsey faced was in December of 1944, the same month that the storm took place, which was on the 18th. I think was a court of inquiry that was to determine if he should be court-martialed. And a lot of the testimony came from the captains and others who had experienced the storm. He probably could have gone on to a court-martial. A report was done, a transcript of the court of inquiry was created. But Nimitz had to realize a couple of things. One, the PR disaster it would be. Your most famous, dynamic, charismatic admiral to the American people is going to get court-martialed. It wasn't like he did something illegal. He just made a couple of bad decisions. The second thing is, this is not the time when you want to lose your best admiral, your fightingest admiral. The war could be won in the next few months. Now, I should say Halsey was sent home on leave for a while to get rest up, and he returned in May to the Third Fleet. But as far as any kind of condemnation, and I should point out something else, Nimitz was sort of covering for Halsey, and in fact, he ordered that everything be classified and squelched and hidden behind radio silence as far as the court of inquiry is concerned. And about Typhoon Cobra himself. I mean, I remember interviewing one of the sailors who had gotten through Typhoon Cobra, and they were actually told, when you get home, you don't discuss this. This never happened. So literally, the court of inquiry transcript, which is about 100 pages of single-space type, was missing, went missing. I found it. It was declassified. It was finally found in the Library of Congress somewhere and declassified under the Bill Clinton administration.
Wow.
So that was a big part of us able to tell the story, was finding the actual original, dusty, dog-eared court of inquiry transcript.
Wow, that's pretty incredible. And as a writer, a historian, what a treasure trove of information.
You could have used the word research nerd, which is what I am.
That works too.
I confess to that. And for a research nerd to find something that nobody else had actually seen before, since it was hidden away, was very enjoyable.
I think we are kindred spirits then.
Yeah.
So how did this event, at least in your mind, shape Halsey's legacy and even the Navy's approach to, say, weather in the years that followed?
It didn't, because the information about the Typhoon and that Halsey had undergone a court of inquiry was suppressed. It didn't really have much impact on his legacy. It could be said that during Halsey's lifetime, I think he died in 1960 something while playing golf. In Halsey's lifetime, I don't think anybody knew, except those of his fellow officers who had experience with him, knew about Halsey's Typhoon, so to speak. It wasn't certainly called that at the time. So it didn't really affect his legacy. As far as the Navy and weather forecasting, I don't think they weren't able to make any immediate changes. It wasn't like, I mean, obviously they told their admirals and captains, don't sail into a typhoon, be a little more cautious. As it happened, the following June in 1945, Halsey sailed into a typhoon, another one. In the book, I think our book, it's called Typhoon Viper. And, there were 75 planes lost, 6 men were swept overboard, 70 ships badly damaged. Again, it was like, well, we didn't see it coming. It wasn't really until post-war, especially when radar became more fine-tuned, that our weather forecasting got better. And also, we made use of commercial jet pilots. There's more jet traffic, commercial jet traffic and plane traffic, and they would radio down to different military bases what their conditions were and what they were observing from 30,000 feet up. Okay.
Interesting. Any final thoughts?
A few very briefly. One of the stories in the book, anecdotes of heroism in the book that we were glad to include, was that of Gerald Ford. The president was a lieutenant on the San Jacinto, a small aircraft carrier, which caught fire during the storm. And it was Gerald Ford, who was the head of the fire brigade, that went down into the bowels of the ship and risked everything, including the possible sinking of a ship if it sank while they were still down there, to put out the fire, and he saved his aircraft carrier. So I think it's an interesting story in the book, and Ford barely alludes to it in his autobiography, but we were able to interview the former president when he was 91 years old. We were told we'd get 20 minutes with him. We got 45 minutes with him, and he
Wow.
described the story in great detail. Another thing, just very briefly, again, what I mentioned earlier in the interview was that unlike some of the other top naval officers, Halsey and MacArthur had a very good relationship. MacArthur was very respectful of Halsey. He liked that fighting admiral kind of image and substance that Halsey had. And when Halsey was back in the States, they asked him about MacArthur, and he said he's a very fine man. I've worked under him for 2 years. I had the greatest admiration and respect for him. He was also very, very tactful to say I worked under him, under MacArthur, not with MacArthur. So that was very tactful. And one last thing, I think what helped make Halsey's Typhoon a good book is that at the time we were working on it, which was, 25 years ago, there was still enough survivors of Typhoon Cobra that we were able to interview them personally. And to go back to one of your earlier questions about the effect on sailors, there was one fellow I contacted who had spent 60 hours in the water before he was rescued. And I think he was down in Maryland. I called him up and I asked him, can I interview you? And he said, give me a couple of days. And he hung up. I gave him my number and he hung up. And I thought he was just getting rid of me. But a couple of days later, he called up and said, okay, I'm ready to talk now. And I said, if you don't mind my asking, what took a couple of days? He said, well, I figure if I'm going to tell you my story, I should first tell it to my wife of 58 years. He'd come back from the war and never told her. And we found that to be true of many other sailors, too. It was such a horrendous, frightful experience that they had to put it behind them.
Oh, I don't doubt that at all. Well, thank you, sir, so much for coming on the podcast and sharing just a little bit, kind of a bird's eye view of this event in World War II. We really, really appreciate it. And we really enjoyed the book. And if you're interested, the book is Halsey's Typhoon. So thank you again.
Thank you, Amanda. This has been very pleasurable to talk about the book.
We hope you enjoyed that episode. If you have questions, comments, or topic suggestions, the MacArthur Memorial team wants to hear from you. You can reach us at macarthurmemorial@norfolk.gov or find us on X at MacArthur1880 or on Facebook and Instagram as MacArthur Memorial.